On the Hieratic Art. Translated from Marsilio Ficino's Latin by Thomas Taylor, 1895. Read by Dan Attrell. The art of divine works is called Theurgy, in which Pythagoras was initiated among the Syrians, as we are informed by Iamblichus in his life of that philosopher. Proclus also was skilled in this art, as may be seen in the life of him by Marinus. Proclus, in his manuscript treatise on daimons, says, as we have before observed, that magic formed the last part of the sacerdotal science, in which place by magic he doubtless means that kind of it which is denominated Theurgy. And that Theurgy was employed by the ancients in their mysteries, I have fully proved in my treatise on the Eleusinian and Bacchic mysteries. This Theurgy, too, is doubtless the same as the magic of Zoroaster, which Plato in the first Alcibiades says consisted of the worship of the gods, on which passage the following account of Theurgy by Proclus was, I have no doubt, originally part of a commentary. For the manuscript commentary of Proclus, which is extant on this dialogue, does not extend to more than a third part of it. And this dissertation on Theurgy, which is only extant in Latin, was published by Ficino, the translator, immediately after his excerpta from this commentary. So that it seems highly probable that the manuscript from which Ficino translated his excerpta was much more perfect than that which has been preserved to us in consequence of containing this account of the Theurgy of the ancients. A note from the reader. In contradiction to what Taylor just said, we actually do have an extant Greek original for this. It's called the Perites Hieratices Technes, and it was translated by Brian Copenhaver in 1988. You can find it in his article Hermes Trismegistus, Proclus, and a Philosophy of Magic in the book Hermeticism and the Renaissance. For Ficino's Latin, see De Sacrificio et Magia in his 1576 Omnia Opera, page 1928 to 1929. Now, on to Taylor's translation of Ficino's Latin paraphrase of Proclus's words on Theurgy. In the same manner as lovers gradually advance from that beauty which is apparent in sensible forms to that which is divine, so the ancient priests, when they considered that there is a certain alliance and sympathy in natural things to each other, and of things manifest to occult powers, and discovered that all things subsist in all, they fabricated a sacred science from this mutual sympathy and similarity. Thus they recognize things supreme in such as are subordinate, and the subordinate in the supreme. In the celestial regions, terrene properties subsisting in a causal and celestial manner, and in earth, celestial properties, but according to a terrene condition. For how shall we account for those plants called heliotropes, that is, attendants on the sun, moving in correspondence with the revolution of its orb, but selenotropes, or attendants on the moon, turning in exact conformity to her motion? It is because all things pray and give hymns to the leaders of their respective orders, but some intellectually and others rationally, some in a natural and others after a sensible manner. Hence the sunflower, as far as it is able, moves in a circular dance towards the sun, so that if anyone could hear the pulsation made by its circuit in the air, he would perceive something composed by a sound of this kind, in honor of its king, such as a plant is capable of framing. Hence, too, we may behold the sun and the moon in the earth, but according to a terrene quality. In the celestial regions, however, all plants and stones and animals possessing an intellectual life according to a celestial nature. Now, the ancients, having contemplated this mutual sympathy of things, applied for occult purposes both celestial and terrene natures, by means of which, through a certain similitude, they deduced divine virtues into this inferior abode. For indeed, similitude itself is a sufficient cause of binding things together in union and consent. Thus, if a piece of paper is heated and afterwards placed near a lamp, though it does not touch the fire, the paper will suddenly be inflamed, and the flame will descend from the superior to the inferior parts. This heated paper we may compare to a certain relation of inferiors to superiors, and its approximation to the lamp to the opportune use of things according to time, place, and matter. But the procession of fire into the paper aptly represents the presence of divine light to that nature which is capable of its perception. Lastly, the inflammation of the paper may be compared to the deification of mortals, and to the illumination of material natures, which are afterwards carried upwards, like the enkindled paper, from a certain participation of divine seed. Again, the lotus, before the rising of the sun, folds its leaves into itself, but gradually expands them on in its rising, unfolding them in proportion to the sun's ascent to the zenith, but as gradually contracting them as that luminary descends to the west. Hence this plant, by the expansion and contraction of its leaves, appears no less to honor the sun than men by the gesture of their eyelids and the motion of their lips. But this imitation and certain participation of supernal light is not only visible in plants, which possess nothing more than a vestige of life, but likewise in particular stones. Thus the sunstone, by its golden rays, imitates those of the sun, but the stone called the eye of heaven, or of the sun, has a figure similar to the pupil of an eye, and a ray shines from the middle of the pupil. Thus, too, the lunar stone, which has a figure similar to the moon when horned, by a certain change of itself, follows the lunar motion. Lastly, the stone called Helioselenus, that is, of the sun and the moon, imitates, after a matter, the congress of those luminaries, which it images by its color, so that all things are full of divine natures, terrestrial natures receiving the plenitude of such that are celestial, but celestial of super-celestial essences, while every order of things proceeds gradually in a beautiful descent from the highest to the lowest. For whatever particulars are collected into one above the order of things are afterwards dilated in descending, various souls being distributed under their various ruling divinities. In the next place, there are many solar animals, such as lions and cocks, which participate, according to their nature, of a certain solar divinity, whence it is wonderful how much inferiors yield to superiors in the same order, though they do not yield in magnitude and power. Hence it is said that a cock is very much feared, and, as it were, reverenced by a lion, the reason of which we cannot assign from matter or sense, but from the contemplation alone of a supernal order. For thus we shall find that the presence of the solar virtue accords more with a cock than with a lion. This will be evident from considering that the cock, as it were, with certain hymns, applauds and calls to the rising sun when he bends his course to us from the antipodes, and that solar angels sometimes appear in forms of this kind, who, though they are without shape, yet present themselves to us, who are connected with shape, in some sensible form. Sometimes, too, there are daimons with leonine front, who, when a cock is placed before them, unless they are of a solar order, suddenly disappear. And this because those natures which have an inferior rank in the same order always reverence their superiors, just as many, on beholding the image of divine men, are accustomed, from the very view, to be fearful of perpetrating anything base. In the end, some things turn round correspondent to the revolutions of the sun, as the plants which we have mentioned, and others after a manner imitate the solar rays, as the palm and the date. some the fiery nature of the sun, as the laurel, and others a different property. For indeed, we may perceive that the properties which are collected in the sun are everywhere distributed to subsequent natures constituted in a solar order, that is, to angels, daimons, souls, animals, plants, and stones. Hence, the authors of the ancient priesthood discovered from things apparent the worship of superior powers, while they mingled some things and purified others. They mingled many things indeed together, because they saw that some simple substances possessed a divine property, though not taken singly, sufficient to call down that particular power, of which they were participants. Hence, by the mingling of many things together, they attracted upon us a supernal influx, and by the composition of one thing from many, they produced an assimilation to that one which is above many, and composed statues from the mixture of various substances conspiring in sympathy and consent. Besides this, they collected composite odors by a divine art into one, comprehending a multitude of powers and symbolizing with the unity of a divine essence, considering that division debilitates each of these, but that mingling them together restores them to the idea of their exemplar. But sometimes one herb or one stone is sufficient to a divine operation. Thus a thistle, Greek kneoron, is sufficient to procure the sudden appearance of some superior power, but a laurel, daphne, rachinum, or a thorny kind of sprig, rhamnos in Greek, the land and sea onion, Greek scylla, the coral, the diamond, and the jasper, operate as a safeguard. The heart of a mole is subservient to divination, but sulfur and marine water to purification. Hence the ancient priests, by the mutual relation and sympathy of things to each other, collected their virtues into one, but expelled them by repugnancy and antipathy, purifying when it was requisite with sulfur and bitumen, and sprinkling with marine water. For sulfur purifies from the sharpness of its odor, but marine water on account of its fiery portion. Besides this, in the worship of the gods, they offered animals and other substances congruous to their natures, and received, in the first place, the powers of daemons, as proximate to natural substances and operations. And by these natural substances they convoked into their presence those powers to which they approached. Afterwards, they proceeded from daemons to the powers and energies of the gods, partly indeed from demoniacal instruction, but partly by their own industry, and interpreting appropriate symbols, and ascending to a proper intelligence of the gods. And lastly, laying aside natural substances and their operations, they received themselves into the communion and fellowship of the gods. Thus marks the end of Proclus's words on Theurgy. Taylor then adds, "The Emperor Julian alludes to this theurgical art in the following extract from his Arguments against the Christians, preserved by Cyril. Quote, For the inspiration which arrives to men from the gods is rare, and exists but in a few. Nor is it easy for every man to partake of this, nor at every time. This has ceased among the Hebrews, nor is it preserved to the present time among the Egyptians. Spontaneous oracles also are seen to yield to temporal periods. This, however, our philanthropic Lord and Father Jupiter understanding, that we might not be entirely deprived of communion with the gods, has given us observation through sacred arts, by which we have at hand sufficient assistance." End quote. For the cause why, at stated times, sacred arts, oracles, and inspiration fail, see the additional notes to my translation of Iamblichus's Life of Pythagoras. The End. On the Hieratic Art, translated from Marsilio Ficino's Latin by Thomas Taylor, 1895, and read by Dan Attrell.